B1. The Hidden Layer Quadrophenia, the 1979 British film that bottled the fury and fragility of an entire generation, anchored by Phil Daniels in what remains one of the most electrifying performances in the history of British cinema. Most fans remember the parkas, the Vespas, the amphetamine-fueled clashes on Brighton Beach. They remember Sting looking impossibly cool. They remember The Who on the soundtrack at a volume that rattled the walls. But what if I told you the film contains a hidden architecture, a design so deliberate, so carefully embedded in every frame, that most viewers have watched it a dozen times and still never fully decoded it? What if the most important moment in the movie isn't the riot, isn't the romance, isn't even the famous final ride toward the cliff, but a quiet beat in a Brighton hotel lobby that rewrites every scene that came before it? Let's pull back the curtain on Quadrophenia and uncover the detail that changes how you see it forever. Here is the big idea, and it is one that almost no one talks about. Quadrophenia is not really a film about mods versus rockers. It is a film about the terrifying instant when every identity you have constructed, every tribe, every outfit, every anthem you have pledged yourself to, collapses under its own weight, and you are left standing with nothing between you and the mirror. The film buries this thesis in 4 interlocking layers that most audiences absorb only as spectacle without realizing what is being done to them. First, there is the deliberate fracturing of Jimmy Cooper's psyche into 4 distinct emotional registers, a structural concept lifted directly from Pete Townshend's original album and translated by director Franc Roddam into cinema through camera distance, color palette, and sound design, rather than a single line of explanatory dialogue. Second, there is a critical creative decision, a battle over the film's very soul, that almost pulled the project apart before a foot of film was ever shot. Third, there is a series of on-set realities, physical and emotional, that bled into the performances in ways that were not entirely planned and could never be entirely replicated. And fourth, there is a visual detail hidden in the film's final 60 seconds that reframes the ending so completely that the movie becomes a different experience once you know where to look. Most fans never figured any of this out. By the end of this video, you will see Quadrophenia with entirely new eyes. 2. A nation on the edge. To understand Quadrophenia, you need to feel what Britain felt in 1964. And then feel what it felt again in 1979, when the film arrived to tell that story back to a nation that had barely moved on. The mid-60s were a fault line. Post-war austerity was loosening its grip on everyday life, but the promise of prosperity had not yet reached working-class teenagers cramming themselves into council flats in South London, Leeds, or Brighton. Into that gap rushed 2 warring youth tribes, the mods, sharp-suited, scooter-riding, amphetamine-wired devotees of American soul music, Italian fashion, and a ferocious attention to detail that bordered on the religious. And the rockers, leather-jacketed, motorcycle-mounted, loyal to early rock and roll, and contemptuous of what they saw as the mods' effete vanity. Their clashes, most famously on the beaches of Brighton and Margate during the bank holiday weekends of 1964, became full-blown national moral panics. The tabloids screamed, Parliament debated. Magistrates handed down harsh sentences designed to make examples of teenagers who, in most cases, had simply shown up looking for a fight and a sense of belonging. Pete Townshend, the guitarist and principal songwriter of The Who, had lived through the mod explosion as a young man. By 1973, now a decade older and grappling with questions of identity that went far beyond fashion, he channeled that memory into a sprawling double album called Quadrophenia. It was a rock opera about a fictional mod named Jimmy who suffers from what Townshend described as a 4-way personality split, each facet mapped onto a member of The Who. Roger Daltrey's toughness, John Entwistle's quiet cool, Keith Moon's lunatic energy, Townshend's own romantic vulnerability. The album was ambitious, occasionally unwieldy, and deeply personal. It did not achieve the crossover commercial dominance of Tommy, the band's earlier rock opera, but it planted something lasting in the cultural soil, a story that felt unfinished, waiting for another medium to complete it. 6 years later, the moment arrived. Britain in 1979 was in turmoil again. Punk had burned through the country like a wildfire, and in its aftermath, a new generation of disillusioned working-class youth was searching for cultural anchors. Producer Bill Curbishley, The Who's manager, saw a convergence of timing and material. A cinematic Quadrophenia could catch this wave, speaking simultaneously to the generation that had lived through the 60s and the generation now inheriting their frustrations. Greenlit with a production budget far more modest than its ambitions demanded, Quadrophenia entered pre-production in late 1978 under the direction of Franc Roddam, a Welsh-born documentarian with no feature film experience but a fierce reputation for authenticity. It was a gamble built on instinct, and it was about to produce something that nobody, not Townshend, not Curbishley, not Roddam himself, fully anticipated. 3. The persona paradox. When audiences first encountered Phil Daniels as Jimmy Cooper, the majority assumed they were watching a naturalistic performance from a working-class kid essentially playing himself. Daniels was from King's Cross. He had the North London accent, the coiled energy, the confrontational stare. The assumption was understandable and almost entirely wrong. Daniels was a trained and experienced performer. A product of the National Youth Theatre, he had already worked in television drama and understood the mechanics of screen acting with a sophistication that his raw, unpolished energy deliberately concealed. What he brought to Jimmy Cooper was not instinct alone. It was a meticulously calibrated performance engineered to feel like instinct. By multiple accounts, Daniels immersed himself in the mod subculture during preparation, speaking with men who had lived through it, studying photographs, absorbing the rhythms of conversation and confrontation that defined the era. He grasped something about Jimmy that a less thoughtful actor might have missed entirely. This was not simply an angry young man. This was a desperately frightened one. A boy performing confidence while drowning in confusion, assembling an identity from pills and parkas and borrowed poses, because the alternative, to sit alone with the question of who he actually was, felt like annihilation. The paradox deepened with Sting. By the time Quadrophenia was shooting, Gordon Sumner was on the brink of global fame. The Police had released their debut album and were generating serious heat on the UK music scene. His casting as Ace Face, the impossibly cool mod leader who commands every room, every dance floor, every street corner he walks through, was partly a practical matter. Sting looked the part in a way that bordered on the unfair. Lean, angular, possessed of cheekbones that seemed designed to catch light and hold it. But Roddam sensed something deeper in the casting. A performer who understood instinctively how surfaces work. Sting's Ace Face is not a character with psychological depth. He is a character who exists entirely as surface, style without substance, magnetism without meaning. And that is the entire point. The film's most devastating thematic revelation depends on the audience believing completely in Ace Face's aura of invincibility, which means the performance had to be immaculate in its superficiality. And here is the tension that nobody discussed publicly at the time. Phil Daniels gave everything. He left himself emotionally exposed in take after take, carrying the weight of almost every frame in the film. Sting gave almost nothing, a cool glance here, a half-smile there, a posture of effortless authority. And both choices were precisely what the film required. The disparity was the design, but the cost was real. Daniels shouldered the emotional burden of the entire picture, and by the time filming wrapped, the toll was visible to everyone around him. That exhaustion, it turned out, would become part of the performance itself. 4. The choice. That redirected everything. Now here is where it gets complicated. The original vision for Quadrophenia looked markedly different from the film that reached cinemas. In the earliest stages of development, conversations centered on a more faithful adaptation of the album, one that would preserve its structure as a rock opera, with The Who's music driving every scene, every emotional beat, every transition. Pete Townshend, who had spent years crafting the album's intricate thematic architecture, naturally favored this approach. He envisioned something in the vein of Tommy's 1975 film adaptation directed by Ken Russell. Stylized, operatic, music-forward, larger than life. Franc Roddam had a fundamentally different instinct. He wanted realism. Not the polished, prettified realism of mainstream British drama, but something closer to the bone. The grit and grain of a Ken Loach film married to the restless energy of a youth picture made by someone who understood that working-class teenagers did not live their lives in neatly composed frames. Roddam wanted natural dialogue, raw, overlapping, profanity-laced, improvised feeling, not lip-synced musical numbers. He wanted locations that smelled like the real thing. He wanted rain. This was not a minor aesthetic disagreement. It was a foundational conflict over what kind of film Quadrophenia was going to be, and it had to be resolved before a single camera rolled. Roddam fought hard for his vision, and ultimately the producers sided with him. The Who's music would remain prominently on the soundtrack. No one was foolish enough to strip it out. But it would function as emotional underscore and punctuation rather than structural framework. The story would be told through Daniel's face, through the grime of real streets, through the chaos of real-seeming crowds, not through musical set pieces. That single decision transformed everything. Jimmy's world became tactile in a way that rock opera simply cannot achieve. You could feel the dampness of the alley behind the dance hall. You could sense the claustrophobia of Jimmy's childhood bedroom with its mod collages and stolen mirrors. The pill-taking was not stylized. It was casual, habitual, embedded in the texture of daily life in a way that felt observed rather than performed. Roddam's insistence on casting largely unknown actors alongside Daniels, faces like Philip Davis, Mark Wingett, Toya Wilcox, and Trevor Laird, many of them young and relatively inexperienced, filled the screen with a sense of chaotic authenticity that no amount of star power could have manufactured. The chemistry between these performers was unpredictable, sometimes volatile, and entirely alive. This is the choice that most film histories gloss over, and it should not be glossed over, because it is the reason Quadrophenia endures while so many other rock opera adaptations of the era have faded into nostalgic curiosity. Roddam chose the difficult path, and the production would test that choice every single day. V. The grind behind the glow. Filming Quadrophenia was, by virtually every account from those who lived through it, an exercise in sustained, controlled chaos. The budget allowed almost no margin for error. Roddam, working on his first feature, had to stretch every available pound, and the constraints shaped every decision on the shooting schedule. Fast setups, minimal takes, a near-total reliance on the cast's ability to deliver compelling performances without the luxury of endless repetition. There were no elaborate lighting rigs. There was no second-unit team covering pickup shots. What Roddam and cinematographer Brian Tufano captured on any given day was, to a large extent, what they were going to use. The Brighton riot sequences, the film's visceral centerpiece, the scenes that burn brightest in audience memory, required hundreds of extras, and Roddam made a characteristically bold decision about where to find them. Rather than hiring professional background performers, he recruited heavily from actual mod and punk communities in London and the South Coast. He wanted real energy. He wanted bodies that moved with genuine aggression and genuine joy. He got both, but he also got volatility. The extras were not always controllable. Adrenaline ran high. On more than one occasion during the beach battle sequences, the line between staged conflict and genuine fighting blurred in ways that electrified the crew and genuinely alarmed the safety coordinators. The footage has a visceral, unmanufactured quality that no amount of choreography could replicate, because some of it was not choreography at all. Phil Daniels bore the heaviest physical and emotional toll. Jimmy Cooper is in virtually every scene of the film, and the character's arc demands a visible, progressive deterioration, from amphetamine-fueled confidence in the early acts to complete psychological disintegration by the climax. Daniels committed to this trajectory with an intensity that impressed and occasionally concerned his director. Night shoots in late autumn on the Brighton seafront left him soaked and shivering for hours. The scenes of Jimmy stumbling through the rain-slicked streets, hollow-eyed and barely coherent, were not entirely simulated. The cold was real. The fatigue was real. The rawness in Daniels' eyes during the film's final act was informed by an actor who had genuinely pushed his reserves to their limit over weeks of demanding work with almost no recovery time built into the schedule. Leslie Ash, playing Steph, the girl Jimmy pursues with clumsy, desperate intensity, later reflected on the discomfort of several key scenes, including the now famous encounter in the back of a car, which was filmed in genuinely cramped conditions with minimal crew. Roddam cultivated an atmosphere of unease on set during these sequences because he wanted performances that vibrated with discomfort rather than Hollywood romance. The result is one of the most uncomfortably authentic depictions of youthful sexual fumbling ever committed to film. It works precisely because it refuses to be glamorous. But the process of achieving that refusal was not easy on anyone involved. And through it all, there was the weather. The British coast in late 1978 did not cooperate. Rain arrived when sun was needed. Wind disrupted sound recording. Shooting schedules were rearranged, sometimes hour by hour. Roddam made choices on the fly that would have terrified a more cautious filmmaker, simplifying scenes, reimagining sequences, accepting imperfection as texture rather than flaw. The film that exists on screen is as much a product of adaptive improvisation under relentless pressure as it is of careful pre-production planning. And somehow, perhaps inevitably, that pressure made everything feel more honest. But that's only half the story. 6. Hidden in plain sight. Now, here is the part most people miss. The first detail is structural, rooted in the concept that gave the project its name. Jimmy Cooper's quadrophenia, his four-way personality split, the fractured selfhood that is the album's central metaphor, is never once explained through dialogue in the film. No character names the condition, no doctor diagnoses it, no voiceover narration spells it out. Roddam made a deliberate choice to reject exposition entirely and instead embed Jimmy's fragmentation in the visual and sonic grammar of the filmmaking itself. Watch carefully and you begin to notice a pattern. When Jimmy is with his mod friends, at the dance hall, on the Brighton seafront, spoiling for a fight, the camera is handheld, tight, crowded into the group. The compositions are claustrophobic and kinetic. Jimmy is aggressive, performative, feeding off the pack energy. This is one Jimmy. When he is alone with Steph, the lighting softens almost imperceptibly. The lens shifts slightly longer. The cutting slows. Jimmy becomes vulnerable, almost childlike, reaching for a connection he does not know how to sustain. This is a second Jimmy. At home with his parents, the scenes in the cramped family flat, Roddam frames Daniels in doorways, corridors, and narrow spaces. The compositions box him in. Jimmy is sullen, compressed, a caged thing. A third Jimmy. And then there are the moments of solitude, on the scooter, on the cliff, staring at the sea, where the camera pulls back into wide, almost dissociated compositions that emphasize how small and alone this young man truly is. A fourth Jimmy. Still, reflective, untethered from every tribe he has tried to join. Roddam confirmed in interviews years after the film's release that this visual system was intentional from the earliest stages of pre-production. He and Tufano map the 4 modes onto specific camera behaviors. It operates entirely below conscious awareness for most viewers. You feel the shifts without understanding why. And it represents one of the most sophisticated pieces of character filmmaking in British cinema of that era. The second detail is a single prop that carries the film's entire thesis. When Jimmy discovers that Ace Face, his idol, the king of the mods, the man he has worshipped as the embodiment of everything cool and free, is working as a bellboy at the Brighton Grand Hotel, the camera lingers on the bellboy's uniform for just a beat longer than feels natural. Most viewers register the surface-level irony. The coolest man in Brighton is a servant. But look more carefully at the composition. The uniform's gold buttons and rigid lines visually echo the military-adjacent imagery that runs through the entire mod subculture. The target symbols, the parkas modeled on army surplus, the regimented dress codes that demand absolute conformity in the name of individuality. Roddam is drawing a connection that extends far beyond one character's hypocrisy. He is suggesting that every uniform is servitude. The mod uniform, the rocker leather, the bellboy coat. They are all costumes worn in someone else's service, and none of them is freedom. The third detail lives in the film's final seconds, and it is the one that has generated the most debate and the most misunderstanding. Jimmy rides Ace Face's stolen Vespa toward the edge of Beachy Head, the towering chalk cliffs that overlook the English Channel. The scooter launches off the precipice. It tumbles, shatters, explodes on the rocks far below. And then the camera cuts. For decades, audiences have argued over whether Jimmy jumps or survives. But here is what almost nobody notices. In the sequence's construction, the scooter goes over the edge, and Jimmy does not. Roddam has stated that the intended reading was always clear to him. Jimmy survives. The scooter, the ultimate mod symbol, the machine that carries the identity he has built and that has now crumbled, is what dies on those rocks. Jimmy is left standing on the cliff, stripped bare, facing the open sky with nothing to define him. If you are watching the film from a place of despair, you may see an ending. If you have come through the other side, you see a beginning. Roddam designed it that way. The ambiguity is not an accident. It is the film's final act of respect for its audience, trusting you to bring your own truth to the edge and look over. That is the kind of filmmaking that does not shout. It waits for you to be ready. 7. A battle for the film's soul. Behind the scenes, Quadrophenia was the site of a quiet but genuinely significant creative war, one that shaped the finished product as profoundly as any performance or location. Pete Townshend's relationship with the adaptation was fraught from the outset. Quadrophenia was his most personal work. He had lived through the mod era. He had spent years translating that experience into a musical narrative of extraordinary complexity and emotional ambition. And now he was watching another artist, a first-time feature director no less, translate his translation into a different medium with different priorities and different rules. Townshend wanted more of The Who's music embedded in the film's fabric. He wanted the album's emotional architecture preserved on screen, the operatic sweep, the spiritual undertones, the sense of Jimmy's story as something mythic rather than merely social. Roddam respected the music deeply, but he resisted the mythology. He believed the film's power would come from specificity, specific accents, specific streets, specific weather patterns, specific class dynamics rooted in observable reality. Every time the script reached toward the mythic, Roddam dragged it back to the pavement. The tension produced genuine friction. Decisions about what to include on the soundtrack, how prominently to feature The Who's tracks, and how much of Townshend's thematic framework to preserve in a film that had deliberately jettisoned the album's structure, became subjects of ongoing negotiation that extended deep into post-production. Townshend wanted certain musical cues to drive entire sequences. Roddam wanted the sequences to breathe on their own terms, with the music arriving as emotional detonation rather than structural scaffolding. The result was a compromise that satisfied neither man completely but served the film brilliantly. Tracks like The Real Me, 5:15, and Love, Reign O'er Me function as precisely timed emotional explosions, arriving at moments when Jimmy's internal world has built to a pressure that only music can release, while the scenes surrounding them remain grounded in a realism that gives those explosions somewhere solid to land. Townshend has been candid about feeling a sense of loss over what the adaptation left behind. Roddam has spoken more diplomatically, acknowledging the difficulty of the collaboration while maintaining that the creative friction ultimately strengthened the work. Neither man was wrong. The Quadrophenia you watch is not one artist's vision executed cleanly. It is a negotiation between two powerful creative instincts, and like all meaningful negotiations, it left both parties feeling they had surrendered too much. What it produced, though, is a film that vibrates between the mythic and the mundane, without ever settling permanently into either register, a quality that gives it a restless, alive feeling that purely realistic or purely operatic approaches could not have achieved. The battle, in the end, was the making of it. 8. The irony no one saw coming here is where the story takes a turn that even a screenwriter would hesitate to invent. The entire thematic engine of Quadrophenia is disillusionment. The film traces the arc of a young man discovering that the identity he has built his life around is hollow, that his heroes are performing, that belonging to a tribe does not protect you from your own emptiness, that cool is a surface with nothing behind it. The film's most devastating scene is the bellboy revelation. Aceface, the untouchable king of the mods, the man Jimmy has elevated into something approaching a god, turns out to be a servant in a hotel, scraping, bowing, carrying luggage for tips. It is the moment the entire edifice crumbles. Now consider what happened in reality. Sting, the actor who played Aceface, became one of the biggest pop stars on the planet within months of the film's release. The police exploded globally. Sting's face appeared on magazine covers across the world. And almost overnight, the small role he had played in a low-budget British film about disillusioned youth became one of the most frequently referenced moments in his career. Not because audiences absorbed the bellboy scene as a critique of image, because they remembered Aceface as aspirational. They wanted to be him. They wanted the suit, the scooter, the angular cheekbones, the effortless authority that the film had spent its entire runtime dismantling. The very lesson Quadrophenia spent 2 hours teaching, that idolizing surfaces is a trap, that cool is a lie, that the person you worship is probably wearing a costume, was inverted by the real-world celebrity of the man who had embodied that surface. Sting became the thing the film warned you about. And the mod revival that Quadrophenia helped ignite in the late 70s and early 80s often embraced the aesthetic without the self-awareness, the parkas without the pain, the scooters without the existential crisis, the sharp suits without the shattering realization of what they cost. Phil Daniels, meanwhile, the actor who had poured everything he had into the complex, contradictory, profoundly human Jimmy Cooper, remained far less famous. A respected, consistently working character actor, a man with a long, varied career across stage and screen. But not a global icon, not a face on a lunchbox. The actor who played the surface became a superstar. The actor who played the depth became a cult figure. If you wanted a single image to capture what Quadrophenia is actually about, the way style devours substance, the way the world rewards the mask and overlooks the face beneath it, you could not improve on that asymmetry. Daniels would later note, with characteristic dry humor, that he had made his peace with the dynamic, that Jimmy Cooper was the kind of role an actor receives once in a lifetime if fortune is kind, and that the film's endurance meant more to him than celebrity. But the irony remains inescapable, and it proves the film's thesis more eloquently than any scene within it. 9. The slow burn to immortality. Quadrophenia's initial reception was solid but not seismic. Upon its release in the autumn of 1979, the film performed respectably at the UK box office and drew generally favorable notices from British critics, but it was not treated as an instant masterpiece. Some reviewers praised Daniels' ferocious commitment while questioning the film's structural coherence. Others admired its energy, but found the second half's descent into psychological fragmentation harder to embrace than the rousing gang sequences of the first. In the United States, the film barely registered, receiving a limited release that failed to connect with audiences who had no cultural framework for mod subculture. And then something remarkable happened. The film refused to disappear. Through the early 1980s, Quadrophenia became the central sacred text of a mod revival sweeping across Britain. Bands like The Jam, Secret Affair, and The Chords drew directly from the aesthetic and emotional vocabulary the film had crystallized. Young people who had not been born in 1964 were suddenly riding Vespas through city streets, wearing parkas over sharp Italian-cut suits, and adopting the precise codes of dress and conduct that Jimmy Cooper had embodied on screen. The film was no longer merely a movie. It had become a style guide, a manifesto, a mirror held up to a new generation that needed to find itself through the same ancient rituals of belonging and rebellion. Home video completed the transformation. On VHS and later DVD, Quadrophenia became one of those rare films that traveled laterally through culture, passed from older sibling to younger, from parent to teenager, from flatmate to flatmate, each generation discovering it anew and finding something that felt startlingly, almost uncomfortably personal. The emotional core transcended its specific setting. A kid in Manchester in 1985 felt it. A teenager in Glasgow in 1997 felt it. A college student in Brooklyn in 2012, watching it alone at 2 a.m. on a laptop, felt it just as keenly. The critical reappraisal arrived alongside the cultural canonization. By the early 2000s, Quadrophenia appeared regularly in authoritative polls of the greatest British films ever made. Phil Daniels' performance was increasingly cited as one of the finest in the history of British screen acting. A raw, unguarded piece of emotional commitment that anticipated the intensity later associated with performers like Gary Oldman and Tim Roth. Roddam's direction, once occasionally dismissed as rough-hewn or structurally uneven, was reframed as intentionally visceral, a deliberate aesthetic rooted in documentary instinct that would influence an entire generation of British filmmakers who valued authenticity over gloss. The film did not shout its way to greatness. It endured its way there, quietly, stubbornly, one new viewer at a time. Echoes. Across decades. The ripple effects of Quadrophenia extend far beyond its own frame, touching cinema, music, fashion, and the broader cultural conversation about youth, class, and identity in ways that continue to surface decades later. In British filmmaking, the movie helped codify a template for the working-class youth drama that would flourish over the following decades. You can trace a direct line from Jimmy Cooper's Brighton to the council estates of Shane Meadows' This Is England, another unflinching portrait of youth subculture, tribal identity, and the seductive danger of belonging to something bigger than yourself. Meadows has acknowledged the influence openly, and the DNA is unmistakable. The handheld camera work, the naturalistic ensemble performances, the refusal to sentimentalize poverty or glamorize the violence that erupts from it. Films like Trainspotting, Fish Tank, and The Selfish Giant all operate in a landscape whose contours Quadrophenia helped to shape. In music, the lineage is even more explicit. The mod revival that crested in the early 1980s owed its entire visual vocabulary to the film. Paul Weller, frontman of The Jam and later the Style Council, became the living embodiment of the mod sensibility Quadrophenia had crystallized on screen, and his enormous influence cascaded forward through decades of British music, into the Britpop explosion of the 1990s, into the sharp-dressed confidence of Oasis and the knowing irony of Blur, and into the enduring British love affair with clothing as cultural statement. When Damon Albarn invited Phil Daniels to deliver the spoken-word vocal on Blur's 1994 single Park Life, a track that became one of the defining anthems of the Britpop era. It was a deliberate act of cultural lineage, a recognition that Daniels' voice carried a weight of meaning that transcended any single role. That collaboration introduced Daniels to an entirely new generation, many of whom traced his career backward and discovered Quadrophenia for the first time. In the broader culture, the film's visual legacy surfaces in places its creators could never have anticipated. The iconography of the mod, the parka, the Target rondelle, the Vespa, has been absorbed into global fashion and design to such a degree that it has long since detached from its historical origins. But for those who know the source, every parka still carries a ghost of Jimmy Cooper, and every scooter rally still echoes with the sound of The Who playing at a volume that shakes the bones. Perhaps most quietly, the film also helped change how cinema treated youth, mental health. Jimmy Cooper's psychological disintegration is not played for melodrama. It is not reduced to a clinical diagnosis or a neat narrative of recovery. It is presented as a lived experience, messy, frightening, recursive, and deeply human. In an era when on-screen portrayals of mental distress were frequently either sensationalized or sentimentalized, Quadrophenia offered something more honest. A portrait of a young man coming apart that treated his pain not as spectacle, but as recognizable truth. That approach would resonate through decades of British and international cinema that sought to depict psychological vulnerability with empathy rather than exploitation. 11th, the mirror that never fades. So why does it endure? Why does a film about a specific British subculture in a specific decade, made on a shoestring by a first-time director, continue to find and move audiences who have no personal connection to mods, rockers, or 1964 Brighton? Because Quadrophenia was never really about mods. It never was. It is about the universal human compulsion to construct an identity from the materials at hand, and the equally universal terror of discovering that the identity you have built is borrowed. Every teenager who has ever defined themselves through a band, a brand, a social group, a political movement, a curated aesthetic, a look, a scene, a crew, an online community knows precisely what Jimmy Cooper feels in his bones. The specific costume changes with each generation. The underlying panic does not. In 1964, it was parkas and Vespas. In 1979, it was safety pins and bondage trousers. In 1995, it was flannel shirts and studied apathy. In 2025, it is algorithmically curated micro-identities and the constant performance of selfhood across platforms designed to reward surfaces and punish depth. The machinery of belonging evolves. The ache beneath it stays exactly the same. What Roddam and Daniels achieved, almost despite the budget constraints, the creative conflicts, the weather, and the compromises forced by circumstance, was a film that captures that ache with an honesty that does not age. Jimmy's fury at his parents, his worship of Aceface, his desperate fumbling attempts at love, his pill-fueled certainty that curdles into pill-fueled despair. His need to belong to something, anything, followed by the shattering realization that belonging was never going to be enough. These are not period details. They are human constants dressed in a mod suit. And that ending, that scooter sailing off the white cliff while Jimmy stands alive on the edge, stripped of every symbol he ever wore. It is the film's final and most generous gift, and it is the one most viewers take the longest to fully unwrap. Quadrophenia does not end with destruction. It ends with the painful, exhilarating, terrifying moment when you stop being a mod, stop being a rocker, stop being any label at all, and face the open, unanswerable question of who you are without a uniform. That moment belongs to no era. it belongs to everyone. When you first watched Quadrophenia, you thought it was a film about the coolest scooter-riding subculture in British history. Here is what the film was telling you all along. The coolest thing Jimmy Cooper ever did was stop trying to be cool. The bravest thing Quadrophenia ever did was suggest that identity is not something you find inside a tribe. It is something you find on the other side of losing one. That is the hidden layer. That is what most fans never figured out. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. 12. Watch it again. If you have seen Quadrophenia before, go back and watch it with fresh eyes. Pay attention to the camera distances shifting with Jimmy's moods. Notice the gold buttons on the bellboy uniform. Let that final shot on the cliff sit with you a beat longer than you usually do. You will find a different film waiting, one that was always there, hidden in plain sight, patient enough to let you arrive on your own terms. If this changed how you see it, leave a like and tell us in the comments. Which scene hits differently now that you know what was buried in every frame?